At my dad's celebration dinner, I handed him a custom-made watch with the inscription, "Time to enjoy what you've built." He scoffed and said, "Shame you'll never build anything worthwhile yourself." I picked it back up, nodded, and left. Overnight, I reversed my investment in the family business. By morning, he was locked out of the bank portal. Then my phone lit up. 8 missed calls. It was only the beginning. What hurt wasn't even the insult. It was the silence afterward. My mother lowered her eyes to her plate. My cousin Janie suddenly became fascinated by the wine list. My uncles, nobody defended me. Nobody told him he had gone too far. They simply waited for the moment to pass, because that was what everyone had always done whenever my father decided to humiliate someone. I reached across the table, took the watch back from him, closed the box, slipped it into my coat pocket, and stood. No screaming, no argument. I simply nodded once and walked out. I had spent months choosing that watch. Walnut face, brushed titanium band, elegant without being flashy. Dad was supposedly retiring from the family business, and I had imagined the gift as some kind of bridge between us. I wanted him to know that despite everything, I respected what he had started. I even had $600 in a red envelope hidden in my car, something I planned to give him privately as a personal thank you. But as I drove through the city afterward, I realized how ridiculous that now felt. At a red light on 9th Street, I pulled the envelope from the glove compartment, stared at it, then shoved it into my briefcase. He wasn't getting that either. The whole drive home, memories started stacking on top of each other. I thought about the family house Dad constantly called the legacy. I had spent about $1,500 repairing it, new porch boards, plumbing work, kitchen tiles I installed myself on weekends. Nobody thanked me. A week earlier, my mother had simply walked into the renovated kitchen and said, "About time. This place stopped looking like a shed." That was the pattern of my life with them. Anything I contributed immediately became something they were entitled to. Anything I accomplished somehow became evidence that I still wasn't doing enough. When I finally got home, I made coffee, even though it was late, and sat down at my desk. The anger had faded into something colder. I opened the company management dashboard and stared at the screen for several minutes. What happened next wasn't spontaneous. I had been preparing for instability for almost a year. The family company technically belonged to both Dad and me, but over the last decade, nearly every part that actually kept it running had shifted into my hands. I negotiated contracts, modernized payroll, updated the client systems, managed banking relationships, handled compliance, and rebuilt the company's digital infrastructure. Dad remained the face everyone recognized. I became the machinery behind that face. A year earlier, I had quietly created an alternate corporate structure, a holding company designed to absorb our major assets if the business ever needed protection. My controlling shares were divided between two legal entities, including one Dad had signed off on without bothering to read the paperwork carefully. Every transfer was legitimate. Every signature was real. I wasn't stealing his business. I was exercising authority that had legally belonged to me for months. That night, I didn't touch a dollar. I simply removed his access. By 3:30 inches the morning, I had reset the administrative credentials, updated the security layers, disconnected his devices from the corporate bank portal, and revoked every digital key associated with him. By 4, I had temporarily restricted the accountant's inherited permissions as well until everything could be reviewed. Only I retained full administrative control. Then I shut the laptop, went to bed, and slept more peacefully than I had expected. My phone started vibrating around 6:30 the next morning. I ignored the first call, then the second, then the third. Eventually, the buzzing became almost constant. When I finally reached for the phone, I saw 81 missed calls. I stared at the number for a long moment. Dad had discovered what happened. More importantly, he had discovered that the daughter he claimed would never build anything worthwhile had somehow built nearly everything he depended on. The office felt strange when I arrived. The receptionist gave me a wide-eyed look as I walked past. People clearly knew something had happened, even if they didn't know what. Greg was pacing outside my office, with his shirt half untucked and his phone clenched in one hand. The second I opened the door, he followed me inside. Danielle, tell me this is some kind of glitch. I sat down, opened my laptop, and checked the systems. Everything remained exactly where I had left it. It's not a glitch. Greg rubbed his face. Your dad called me at 5 this morning screaming. He drove to the bank in his pajamas. I looked at him. He should have worn a suit. Might have looked more professional when they told him he doesn't represent the company anymore. Greg stared at me for a moment before asking what had happened. So I told him about dinner, the watch, the inscription, my father's insult, and the silence afterward. When I finished, Greg shook his head slowly. He actually said that in front of everyone? Instead of answering, I pulled the watch box from my bag and handed it to him. He turned the watch over and read the engraving. Time to enjoy what you've built. His expression changed immediately. You really meant this? I nodded. Yeah, I really did. For the rest of the morning, Dad tried everything. Banking, payroll, client contracts, vendor accounts. Every attempt was denied. Several came from his home IP address, so I blocked those routes too. At 11:48, my mother started texting me. Please call your father. Whatever happened, we can fix this. He didn't mean it like that, Danielle. You know how he is. I ignored the message. Then she called 6 times. I ignored those too. At 1:15 that afternoon, she showed up at my office. She looked exhausted when she sat across from me, like years of covering for my father were finally showing on her face. Your father is panicking, she said. He hasn't slept. He thinks this is all some mistake. I told her it wasn't. She admitted he had said things he shouldn't have said and asked me to come to the house that evening so the 3 of us could talk. I looked directly at her. Will he apologize? She hesitated. That single pause told me everything. I'm not coming over so he can lecture me again. She said he was scared. I told her, then he can say 3 words. Her expression tightened. Danielle, your father has never apologized in his life. I leaned back in my chair. Exactly, Mom. That's the problem. She stood slowly and reminded me that he was still my father. I haven't forgotten, I said. He did. That night, I ate takeout alone while imagining him sitting at the head of the table in the old house, waiting for me to walk through the door and fix everything like I always had. I never showed up, and he never apologized. The next morning, security called to tell me Dad had tried to enter the office after hours. His old key still opened the exterior door, but when he reached the server room and discovered his access code no longer worked, he lost control. And pounded on the door, demanded access, and refused to leave until Greg drove down and convinced him to go home. My first call that morning was to a locksmith. The digital doors had already closed. Now the physical ones were closing too. The first thing I did after security told me what happened was send a formal notice to the board. It was short, professional, and deliberately unemotional. I stated that I had assumed full operational control effective immediately, that payroll would continue without disruption, that client delivery would remain unchanged, and that no major decisions would be made recklessly. I made one thing clear. This was not a daughter throwing a tantrum because her father embarrassed her at dinner. This was an ownership transition that had been legally possible for months and operationally necessary for years. I expected resistance. Instead, almost nobody pushed back. A few directors asked if I was okay. One replied with only 4 words. Honestly, about time, Danielle. That message told me more about my father's reputation inside the company than any board meeting ever had. The family gossip started almost immediately. Aunt Sharon, who normally defended Dad no matter what he did, was apparently furious with him. According to Janie, Sharon told him straight to his face, "You made your own daughter hate you. That isn't Danielle's failure. That's yours." Janie herself admitted to my mother that watching Dad humiliate me at dinner had felt like watching someone kick a dog that had just brought him a gift. Those weren't the kinds of things my relatives usually said about him. For years, they had survived by stepping around his ego. Now that he no longer held the company over everyone's heads, people were suddenly finding their voices. Dad noticed the change too, and instead of reflecting on why it was happening, he decided to retaliate. He started visiting suppliers he had known for years and telling them I was cutting costs, planning layoffs, and preparing to liquidate the company. One supplier called me personally because he had known me since I was a teenager. "I don't know what's going on between you two," he said, "but your father is telling people the business is about to collapse." I thanked him for warning me and spent the next several days reviewing every vendor agreement Dad had personally negotiated. Ironically, his revenge gave me an excuse to fix relationships I had wanted to restructure for years. I replaced several overpriced suppliers, consolidated our logistics contracts, and eliminated unnecessary middlemen who had survived mainly because they were Dad's friends. Within 2 weeks, revenue actually increased. Expenses fell. Delivery times improved. Staff morale went up because people no longer had to work around inefficient systems just to protect Dad's relationships. I could almost feel how much that must have infuriated him. He had spent years implying the company would fall apart without him. Instead, the numbers improved the moment he stopped touching it. That was when he called a lawyer. I would be lying if I said that didn't make me nervous. I spent an entire afternoon with our legal team going through the ownership records line by line, every transfer, every shareholder agreement, every document he had signed, every authority delegation. We checked the holding company structure twice. Then, a third time. It was airtight. Dad's role had been increasingly ceremonial for years. He simply never bothered to understand how much control he had already surrendered. His attorney eventually sent a letter, accusing me of improperly taking over the company. Our attorney responded with the signed documents and the corporate history. 3 days later, Dad stopped coming to the office entirely. He didn't stop calling, though. My phone would light up 15 or 20 times a day. I never answered. Then I took the Lexus. It wasn't revenge, no matter what he told everyone. The car belonged to the company. The registration was corporate. Insurance was paid through corporate accounts. Dad had simply driven it for so long that he had convinced himself it was his. I had the plates pulled from his authorization records and remotely deactivated the company access key. The next morning, he climbed into the Lexus, pressed the ignition, and nothing happened. He called me 14 times before noon. I ignored every call. That evening, Mom sent me one message. "He's sitting in the garage, staring at the car like it's going to come back to life." I read it twice. There was something almost absurd about the image. This was a man who had spent decades confusing access with ownership. The business, the money, the car, the family house, even the people around him if he had been allowed to use something long enough. He decided it belonged to him. Now, one by one, reality was correcting him. The next morning, my mother called, sounding like she hadn't slept. "He's gone." I asked what she meant. She said Dad had packed a duffel bag before sunrise, walked out without explaining where he was going, and said only that he needed air. This was the same man who once refused to leave a wedding early because he hadn't finished his wine. I assumed he would return by evening. He didn't. And that was when things started becoming stranger. That afternoon, a man in a cheap suit walked into the office, asking for me by name. He claimed he was conducting an independent financial inquiry on behalf of a former executive. He had no proper identification, no legal paperwork, only a badly printed business card with an email address that looked like it had been created that morning. I asked whether he understood what a restraining order was. Greg escorted him out before he could finish whatever speech he had prepared. I knew immediately Dad was behind it, but that stunt turned out to be nothing compared with what happened a few hours later. At 5:14 p.m., a banker I knew from one of our corporate accounts called me. Dad had walked into an uptown branch claiming he was the founder and CEO of the company and attempted to take out a loan under our original business name. The problem was that the original entity had already been legally dissolved and absorbed into the new corporate structure months earlier. The application was flagged almost instantly. The banker called me for verification. I told him plainly, that company no longer exists. He has no authority under the current ownership. There was a pause on the line before he informed me that, depending on what Dad had represented on the paperwork, the application could potentially be treated as attempted fraud. That was the moment the situation stopped being merely embarrassing and started becoming dangerous for him. By the next morning, the board knew about the bank incident. Janie sent me a screenshot of a Facebook post Sharon had written. Some people don't know how to retire gracefully. She never used his name, but everyone knew exactly who she meant. Calls began coming in from relatives who weren't angry with me at all. They were shocked by Dad. Some sounded disappointed. Others sounded almost relieved, like they had spent years waiting for someone else to finally challenge him. Then my mother did something I never expected. She left him. She packed 2 bags, took her own car, and drove to Albany to stay with her sister. She didn't argue. She didn't threaten. She left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. "I'm tired of covering for you. Maybe now you'll hear the silence." A few hours later, she called me from my aunt's house. Her voice sounded different. Not happier, exactly, but lighter. "It was never really about the business, Danielle," she said. "It was about control. Everything with your father always was." I didn't answer because there was nothing to disagree with. Without Mom there to soften every consequence, Dad went into full panic mode. He showed up unannounced at our biggest logistics vendor, asking whether they still honored his agreements. They didn't. Security escorted him out. He called several longtime clients, apparently expecting loyalty. Instead, those clients called me afterward, confused and embarrassed on his behalf. Every attempt he made to prove he still mattered seemed to produce more evidence that he didn't have authority anymore. Then came his biggest legal move. His lawyer filed a petition contesting the business transfer. Dad claimed I had manipulated him into signing away control and suggested he hadn't been mentally sound when the paperwork was executed. The accusation was insulting, but the filing itself was worse for him. They submitted it under the wrong corporate name, the dissolved one. Again. This time, the court flagged the discrepancy as more than a clerical mistake because the filing represented a non-existent entity as active. That triggered a compliance review with the bank. One of Dad's remaining personal business accounts still had an old connection to that frozen corporate structure. As part of the review, the bank locked it temporarily. Suddenly, even the small amount of business-related money he still believed he controlled was inaccessible. In less than 4 weeks, my father had gone from family patriarch to a man locked outside nearly every system he once considered his. No company, no Lexus, no corporate banking, no wife waiting at home to explain his behavior to everyone else. And still, he never called me to apologize. Not once. That was the part that finally made everything clear. He could lose the company he spent his life bragging about. He could lose the car, the authority, the people who used to laugh nervously at his insults. He could even watch my mother walk out of the house after decades beside him. But saying, "I was wrong," still seemed more painful to him than losing all of it. By then, I wasn't angry anymore. I was watching a man destroy himself because admitting he had hurt his daughter felt more unbearable than watching his entire kingdom disappear. It had been 5 days since Mom left, and Dad still hadn't contacted me. No text, no call, not even one of those indirect messages through a relative pretending to check in. I knew him well enough to understand that silence never meant surrender. It usually meant he was planning something, or trying to rebuild the story in his head until he could once again become the victim. But there wasn't much left to rewrite. The Lexus was gone, his accounts were restricted, his legal challenge was collapsing, and the attorney who had filed that disastrous petition was already distancing himself. Without Mom in the house smoothing over every consequence, I imagined the silence around him had become unbearable. Then, at 6:43, one evening, I got a message from Mike, an old family friend who had admired my father for years. "You free to talk? Just left your parents' place. Your dad's not doing great," I called him. Mike said Dad had invited him over for dinner, probably expecting sympathy. But the conversation became strange, almost immediately. Dad blamed me for destroying his reputation, then claimed he had intentionally allowed me to run the company so I could learn responsibility, then minutes later, accused me of stealing the same company from him. I don't think he knows what he believes anymore, Mike said. That didn't surprise me. My father had spent decades building a world where his version of events was automatically accepted. Now that nobody was accepting it, he didn't seem to know who he was. Mom called the next morning. She had returned to the house briefly to collect some clothes. I found him sitting on the couch with the blinds closed, she said. Same clothes for 3 days, watching reruns. The house smells like stale beer. She told him she was staying another week with her sister. Dad barely reacted. He just stared at the television and said, "Do what you want. Everyone else does." That sentence stayed with me because even after losing nearly everything, he still saw himself as the person being abandoned. He couldn't see the years of insults, control, manipulation, or the people constantly cleaning up behind him. In his mind, consequences were simply cruelty committed by other people. Later that night, Mom sent me a photo of Dad's home office. The wall that used to be covered with newspaper clippings, framed business awards, photographs, and articles about the company was completely bare. Everything had been removed and dumped into a cardboard box marked storage. Then I noticed something inside the box. The watch. My watch. Still sitting in its case among old papers and forgotten plaques. Time to enjoy what you've built. I stared at the picture longer than I should have. Something inside me finally disconnected. I called our legal department the next morning and authorized the last piece of paperwork separating him from the company. His executive emeritus pension had always depended on cooperative transition and continued participation. He had violated nearly every clause. The benefit was formally revoked. By afternoon, relatives were discussing him in family group chats as if years of fear had suddenly evaporated. Sharon sent me a screenshot of one conversation where several cousins were talking openly about Dad's controlling behavior and the way everyone had spent years protecting his ego. Some of those same people had sat silently at dinner while he humiliated me. Now they were acting as though his behavior had always been obvious. I didn't feel vindicated. Mostly, it made me realize how quickly people discover their principles after someone loses power. One message from Janie stood out. Honestly, I hope he finally understands what he lost. I never responded. I wasn't convinced he ever would. 10 days after the pension paperwork was finalized, my phone rang from an unfamiliar number. I recognized his voice before he finished saying my name. "Danielle, I think we should talk. Father to daughter. Just sit down. I want to make things right." His voice was quieter than usual, almost shaky, but I listened for the only words that mattered. They never came. No, "I'm sorry." No, "I was wrong." No acknowledgement of the dinner, the insults, or the years before it. He wanted a meeting, but what he really wanted was access to me, to the person who had always eventually stepped in and fixed whatever he damaged. I let the voicemail end and never called back. The following day, Mom arrived at my apartment carrying a suitcase. "I need somewhere to stay for a few nights," she said. She sat on my couch and looked as if she had been holding her breath for 30 years. Over the next several days, she finally began saying things she had previously only hinted at. Dad stayed awake until 3 in the morning watching television, calling old clients, complaining about the Lexus, the company, the money, and me. He kept insisting that if I would just come back to the house, everything could return to normal. "He still thinks you're going to fix it," Mom told me. "Like if he waits long enough, you'll get tired and put everything back." On her 4th night with me, Mom admitted something I never expected to hear. I always thought if I kept everything calm, it would balance out his storms. But it didn't. It just taught him he could create a mess because someone else would clean it. She stared down at her hands before adding, "He's not going to change, Danielle. Even if he loses everything, he'll find someone else to blame." Hearing her say it felt strange. For most of my life, she had been the person asking me to forgive him, because that's just how he is. Now she finally understood that those words hadn't protected the family. They had protected him from ever needing to change. 2 weeks later, his lawyer made one final attempt, claiming I had illegally taken the Lexus. Our legal team sent back the title, registration, insurance records, and company ownership documentation. The response came quickly. He had no legal standing. Shortly afterward, that attorney dropped him too. Through a mutual acquaintance, I heard Dad had started riding the bus. The same man who once mocked people for using public transportation was now walking several blocks every morning to catch the number 27 downtown. I tried not to enjoy the irony. Mostly, I wondered whether standing at that bus stop had taught him anything. Probably not. The family house started deteriorating again. A pipe leaked. Paint began peeling from the porch. Bills accumulated on the kitchen counter. For years, problems like that had somehow found their way to me, and I had always solved them. This time, I did nothing. Meanwhile, the company was thriving. Profits were up, staff turnover fell. 3 former clients came back after hearing Dad was permanently removed from operations. Meetings became calmer. People started making decisions without wondering whether his ego would interfere. The company he believed could not survive without him seemed healthier, without the weight of proving that belief true. One afternoon, I ran into Aunt Sharon at the grocery store. She walked straight toward me and hugged me. No sarcasm, no passive-aggressive remark. Just a quiet hug. Sometimes people have to lose everything before they understand what they had, she said. I nodded, but I didn't tell her what I was thinking. Losing everything didn't guarantee understanding. Sometimes people simply lost everything and spent the rest of their lives blaming whoever finally stopped giving it back. My father had built something impressive once. That part was true. He built a company, a reputation, a house full of awards, and a family that revolved around his approval. But somewhere along the way, he confused building a kingdom with owning everyone inside it. He ruled through fear, obligation, and the certainty that someone would always repair the damage he caused. Then one night, after insulting the daughter who had been quietly holding his world together, he discovered what happened when that daughter finally stopped. The walls didn't collapse because I destroyed them. They collapsed because I stopped holding them up. And when everything came down, there was nobody left standing beside him. Not the employees who once feared him, not the relatives who once defended him, not my mother who spent decades cleaning up his messes, and finally, not me.